Case number 1. Patricia Krenwinkel. Back in the spring of 1971, a California court record was filed that would remain unchanged for over 50 years. 7 counts of first-degree murder, 1 killer, 1 death sentence. The entry was not just shocking because of its severity. The real chill came from the notes that followed. Records described a woman who did not just take part in these gruesome crimes, but according to the court, she actually organized the others who helped carry them out. Patricia Diane Krenwinkel was born in Los Angeles on December 3, 1947, to an insurance salesman and a homemaker. She grew up in a household marked by parental separation. By her late teens, she had developed what others called a fragile identity and a deep need to belong. She was working as a processing clerk in Manhattan Beach until 1967, when she met Charles Manson at a beachside apartment party. Within days, she quit her job, leaving her car and final paycheck behind to follow Manson straight to San Francisco. Friends from her past saw a quiet, unremarkable young woman who was always eager to please and never stood up for herself. But the woman who emerged within the Manson family was a completely different person by almost every account. Inside the cult, Krenwinkel was far more than just a follower. Decades of testimony would eventually reveal a much darker role in the group. She acted as an enforcer, watching the other women, handing out Manson's orders, and making sure everyone stayed in line. This was a role that both prosecutors and Governor Gavin Newsom would later highlight when reviewing her terrifying conduct. By the summer of 1969, she had been with the family for about 2 years. By her own admission, she was now completely devoted to Manson's authority. On the night of August 9, 1969, Krenwinkel drove to 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon as part of a hit squad sent by Manson. Inside were actress Sharon Tate, who was 26 and nearly 9 months pregnant, and her friend, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring. Also there were Coffee Abigail Foulier, aged 26, and Wojciech Fowski, aged 32. All were killed that horrific evening. A 5th victim, 18-year-old Stephen Parent, was found dead near the front gate of the property. Evidence showed Krenwinkel chased Abigail Fulger as she tried to flee for her life across the dark lawn. She eventually stabbed her 28 times. The very next night, on August 10, 1969, Krenwinkel joined another group sent to a home on Waverly Drive, where Loana, who was 44, and his wife Rosemary, aged 38, were both murdered. At the scene, the words "Helter Skelter" were scrawled in the victim's blood. It was later confirmed that Krenwinkel had written them herself. Evidence proved she was an active killer at both Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive over 2 terrifying, back-to-back nights. The investigation built a massive case using eyewitness accounts, testimony from other family members who turned on her, and Krenwinkel's own confessions during her later parole hearings. Her case moved forward alongside the trials of Charles Manson and co-defendants Charles Watson and Susan Atkins. Even during the trial, Krenwinkel remained fiercely loyal to Manson, staging public displays of devotion that were captured by every camera and reporter in the courtroom. Prosecutors proved that her role was not some accident. She was central to the group's violence, making sure the horror was carried out and the cult stayed together. On March 29, 1971, after a massive 7-month trial that gripped the entire nation, the jury found her guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder. Patricia Krenwinkel was sentenced to death. But the next year, a Supreme Court ruling struck down all death sentences in California, handed out before 1972. Because of that, her sentence was automatically changed to life in prison with the chance of parole. Over the next several decades, she was denied parole 14 different times. But in 2022, the parole board finally recommended her release. Governor Gavin Newsom stepped in and blocked it, writing that she was a leader in the cult and an enforcer of Manson's tyranny. In May 2025, the parole board recommended her release once again. By October 2025, Newsom blocked her again, stating she still lacks the insight needed to be safely released back into society. At 77 years old, Krenwinkel remains behind bars. She is currently the longest-serving female inmate in the entire California prison system. It is a record that, much like her original sentence, was filed away and has remained there ever since. It wasn't just what she did that set her apart from others in the case, but the terrifying role she occupied within the system that allowed it. That haunting distinction has colored every review of her story from the very beginning. Today, we look at a woman who never actually stood at the scene of the horrific crimes she allegedly orchestrated. That cold distance was exactly what made her so incredibly difficult for the state to prosecute. Case 2, Valentina de Andrade. The investigation eventually led to a courtroom in Belém, Brazil, starting not with a major breakthrough, but with a strange procedural error that took years to uncover. When authorities in power finally opened the case files in the early 1990s, they realized the initial inquiry into the missing boys of Altamira had been closed without any autopsies, without forensic searches of the sites, and without a single suspect being named by the local police. The file was simply marked resolved. But it wasn't. Valentina de Andrade was born September 28, 1931, in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul. Years before she began her intense preaching, those who knew her saw a local seer, a woman famous for her supposed psychic abilities and fortune-telling skills. Her quiet influence spread slowly through hidden social circles. In 1981, she formalized her group as Superior Universal Alignment. Her teachings were complex, extensive, and deeply codified. It was all compiled in a book she wrote called God the Great Scam. The text attacked conventional religion, describing a cosmos ruled by alien intelligences who supposedly sent their orders directly to de Andrade herself. One specific claim stood out. She preached that any male children born after 1981 were actually tools of absolute evil and the root of cosmic rot. It was a terrifying theological stance. She gathered followers across the country, and by the late 80s, she had built a stronghold in the remote city of Altamira. That community was isolated. It was poor, desperate, and far from the reach of the country's law enforcement centers. Those harsh conditions mattered deeply. Between 1989 and 1993, boys between 8 and 14 started vanishing. The disappearances piled up, but no one was ever found. By the time the case was reopened in 1993, 19 boys were gone. 6 bodies were eventually recovered. Every victim showed signs of surgical castration performed with a precision that investigators knew was far beyond the skills of a common criminal. The trail pointed toward medical professionals. 5 of those boys were never found. A single survivor, later identified as Leandro Nascimento Pinheiro, was finally able to look back and name his brutal captors. He named 2 doctors, a businessman, a cop, and according to his testimony, Valentina de Andrade herself. His story was a nightmare. Victims drugged, mutilated, and murdered, with their organs supposedly harvested and removed, then sold outside Brazil. Today, we're looking at an investigation that was crippled by massive procedural failures. No autopsies were ever performed on the remains found during the first investigation. Forensic teams never properly examined the sites where the bodies were discovered. Witnesses told conflicting stories, and one key individual even forgot the years the events took place when he was questioned on the stand. These massive holes in the evidence would eventually save the defense. De Andrade fled the country once she was named a suspect, hiding across South America for years before she was finally caught and extradited. She and 4 others stood trial in the city of Belém, in a high-stakes proceeding that lasted 17 days. Her 4 fellow defendants, including 2 doctors, were convicted and handed sentences between 35 and 77 years for their roles in the horrific mutilations. De Andrade's defense team presented police records, providing an alibi that showed she wasn't even in Altamira during the period in question. The state's case relied heavily on witness stories and her leadership, arguing her doctrines sparked the violence, but they found absolutely no physical evidence placing her at any of the crime scenes. On December 5, 2003, a jury in Belém delivered their verdict of not guilty by 6-1. Judge Ronaldo Valle announced the acquittal. De Andrade, then 72, fainted in the courtroom the second she heard the verdict. Families in the gallery protested loudly. Prosecutors vowed to appeal, but she walked free. She was never jailed. Later, reports placed her leading a group of followers in Buenos Aires. The case remained legally contested. Then a serial killer in Marino confessed to dozens of child murders. This added a layer of uncertainty to an already disputed record. What was not disputed was her doctrine. De Andrade wrote that children born after 1981 were instruments of a false god. Her followers were sentenced to decades. The woman who wrote the words simply walked away. You and I are looking at a woman who built a machine to kill for her. Case 3. Ma Anand Sheela. Signs of trouble in Oregon first reached health officials in the autumn of 1984. It was not a police report, but a routine health department notification. Multiple restaurants in the Dalles saw a sudden spike in severe stomach illnesses. State officials logged it as food safety. The Centers for Disease Control followed routine channels. No criminal report was filed. For over a year, it remained a simple medical inquiry. Sheela Ambalal Patel was born in late 1949 in Gujarat, India. She arrived in America as a young woman in the late 1960s. Eventually, she became deeply involved with the Indian mystic Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho. By the early 80s, she had become his secretary and the movement's second in command. In 1981, Sheela moved the group to a 64,000-acre ranch in Oregon. There, she built a fully functioning city called Rajneeshpuram from the desert ground up. She managed the finances and handled the complex relations with the local government. She directed their communications and was the Bhagwan's primary link to the outside world. Professionals who met her saw a figure of immense power and organizational authority. Come with me as we see how this infrastructure was used for crime. Federal investigators later discovered that Sheela and her inner circle spent 1984 planning something. They cultivated a dangerous strain of salmonella inside a makeshift laboratory on the ranch. They bought the bacteria in Seattle and produced massive quantities of it in a secret facility. Between September 9th and September 17th, members of the group visited 10 restaurants and poisoned the salad bars with the bacteria. Their objective, as prosecutors later revealed, was a form of chemical voter suppression. They wanted to sicken enough voters to keep them home on election day. This would help Rajneeshi candidates win 2 seats on the county commission. The outbreak poisoned 751 people, sending 45 to the hospital. Remarkably, no deaths were reported. Officials initially blamed food handling, until the Bhagwan himself pointed the finger at Sheela. After she fled in 1985, he publicly accused her of orchestrating the attack. Police raided the commune and found bacterial cultures matching the outbreak strain. They also found wiretapping networks and evidence of even darker criminal conspiracies. One plot was an organized plan to assassinate United States Attorney Charles Turner. He was leading the investigation into the commune's crimes. Turner had been looking into their immigration fraud and their growing list of violations. Sheela also organized an attempt to murder a doctor using a syringe of poison. That attempt failed, and Sheela fled to West Germany in September. You and I see how it ended. She was arrested in October 1985. After the extradition process, she arrived back in the United States in February 1986. Federal prosecutors and the Oregon Attorney General teamed up to bring a joint case against her in court. The charges covered the mass poisonings and the hits on officials. In July 1986, Sheela pleaded guilty to first-degree assault. She admitted to conspiracy, second-degree assault, wiretapping, and burning down a county office building. The judge handed down 3 concurrent 20-year prison sentences. That was later cut to 4.5 years. After a $470,000 fine, she served 29 months in a Dublin federal prison. She was released early for good behavior and immediately deported from California back to West Germany. Eventually, she settled in Switzerland, where she married and bought 2 nursing homes for the elderly. In 1999, a Swiss court convicted her for plotting a murder linked to the Turner assassination, sentencing her only to the time she had already served. To this day, the 1984 Salmonella attack stands as the largest act of bioterrorism ever committed on American soil. It all started with a simple administrative record, nothing more than a routine public health notification. A county health official logged it, but it sat in the file for 13 months before anyone realized it was actually a crime. Sheela had planned it exactly like that. She used the entire public health system as her unwitting cover. Now, let's look at a case where a twisted ideology became the weapon of choice. Not a virus, not a physical strike, but a belief system weaponized against the very people living closest to the woman who built it. Case 4, Lori Vallow Daybell. In November 2019, Rexburg police went to check on the welfare of 2 young children. They were looking for 7-year-old Joshua Vallow and 16-year-old Tyle Ryan. The grandparents asked for the check because they could not reach the kids or get any information about where they were from the rest of the family. Their mother, Lori Vallow, calmly told the officers that her children were staying with other relatives, but she could not name those family members. The officers noted the strange behavior and wrote everything down in their official report. It was a strange behavioral deviation. The welfare check raised far more questions than it answered. It would be 7 long months before the truth about the children finally came out. Lori Vallow was born on June 26, 1973, in San Bernardino, California. She was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For years, her community saw her as a bright, energetic, and devoted woman who was deeply involved in her faith. She was a mother of 3. She was active in her church and well-liked by neighbors in the Arizona suburbs, where she lived with her husband, Charles Vallow, and their children. Later testimony revealed that in 2018, things changed. She began following a fringe theology alongside a man named Chad Dell. Chad was an author who wrote about Doomsday prophecies. His dark ideas soon became the guiding force behind every decision Lori made. In their world, every person was labeled as either a light or a dark spiritual being. If they labeled you as dark, they used a specific term for you, a zombie. These were human shells where the original soul had been completely pushed out. Detectives later found that the zombie label had been given to her husband Charles, Chad's wife Tammy, and both of the children Tyle Ryan and Joshua Vallow. Charles Vallow filed for divorce in February 2019, even begging the state to give his wife a psychiatric evaluation. By July, Charles was dead, shot in their Arizona home by Lori's brother, a man named Alex Cox. Cox claimed it was self-defense. 5 months later, he was dead too, taken by a sudden blood clot in his lungs. In October 2019, Chad's wife Tammy died at their Idaho home. At first, her death was recorded as being from natural causes. Barely 2 weeks later, Lori Vallow and Chad Dell were in Hawaii, celebrating their brand new marriage. That first report in Rexburg became the foundation for a massive investigation that eventually reached across Idaho, Arizona, and the islands of Hawaii. Police realized that every time they talked to Lori, her story about where the kids were changed. Her phone records told a dark story of constant messages between her, Chad, and their circle while the children were missing. In June 2020, police searched Chad Dell's Idaho property and found the remains of both missing children buried deep within the grounds. Forensics confirmed that little Joshua had been buried in a pet cemetery at the very back of the yard. Tyle Ryan's remains had been burned and dismembered. This discovery forced police to reopen the investigation into Tammy Dell's death. They exhumed her body in December, and forensic tests proved she was actually smothered. It was a clear murder, not the natural death they first recorded. We'll see how the prosecution built their case on digital evidence. Testimony from the extended family network laid the groundwork, alongside records of the couple's theological letters and the forensic findings from the property excavation. It became one of the most documented domestic criminal conspiracies in the history of the Idaho judicial system. The trial of Lori Vallow Daybell in Ada County ended on May 12, 2023, with a jury returning convictions on all counts: first-degree murder in the deaths of her children, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Tammy Dell. She also faced grand theft charges for stealing Social Security benefits in her children's names long after they had already been killed. On July 31, 2023, Judge Stephen Boyce sentenced her to 5 life terms without parole, just as separate legal proceedings were beginning in Arizona. In April 2025, she was convicted of conspiring to kill Charles Vallow. By June, another conviction followed for targeting Brandon Budrow, who survived being fired upon outside his home. On July 25, 2025, Judge Justin Barresi added 2 more life terms to be served consecutively to her previous Idaho sentences. The judge cited what he called an unparalleled degree of calculation and manipulation across the full scope of her crimes. She currently holds a total of 7 life sentences across 2 states. The welfare check report that launched the investigation was just a standard notation about a small behavioral inconsistency. It was the first record in a case that would take 5.5 years to reach its final sentencing. Tragically, the children named in that report had already been dead for months. Now let's look at an institution rather than a household. It was a system, not a family, but the mechanism of control was identical. A woman used faith to determine who was protected and who was not. Case 5. Alondra Ocampo. The California Department of Justice investigation into Lou Del Mundo did not start with a report from a victim. It began in 2018 as a simple internal review of conduct within a very specific organizational structure. Behavioral irregularities were flagged. When mapped across multiple instances and locations, they revealed something far more calculated than a few isolated mistakes. Investigators uncovered what they described as a consistent operational model of control, rather than a collection of random incidents. The people caught at the center of this ring were not all the same person. One was a woman in her mid-30s who held a senior position of spiritual authority within the church's Southern California congregational network. She was a woman whose documented closeness to the apostolic leadership gave her orders a force that, within their theological world, was very difficult for younger and newer members to question. Alondra Ocampo was born around 1983 and spent her formative years deeply embedded in Luz del Mundo, a Guadalajara-based Pentecostal megachurch, whose founder had established a not theology where every new apostle was believed to hold a spiritual authority equal to that of the original biblical apostles themselves. The church claimed over 1 million members worldwide, across 50 nations, maintaining a strict and suffocating hierarchy in every single country and congregation where it set down roots. Women did hold some positions of influence in congregational life, but that power only existed to serve the apostle, Nason Juan Garcia. He took the title in 2014 after his father passed away, and his word became absolute law for everyone. Ocampo she held a recognized, trusted role within that hierarchy. Everyone attending her services saw her as a powerful figure, with high spiritual standing and direct organizational access. She represented a figure whose closeness to the apostle turned her commands into a heavy spiritual and institutional obligation for the faithful. Between 2015 and 2019, investigators from the California Department of Justice discovered evidence showing that Ocampo used her high standing in a specific, calculated and dark way. According to the prosecution, she targeted underage girls within the Southern California congregations of Luz del Mundo, using their own faith to groom them for contact with Garcia, and then setting up meetings under false pretenses to hide the true, disturbing nature of what was happening. The state alleged she told these girls that refusing Garcia was the same as committing a sin against God, twisting the very logic of he twisted religious power into a weapon of control, masking every threat with words of devotion and divine submission. Evidence from later hearings proved she didn't just watch, she actively participated in attacking at least one victim. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. The church's rigid hierarchy wasn't just a setting for these crimes, but the very engine that enabled them. On June 3, 2019, Ocampo was arrested at Los Angeles International Airport along with Garcia and another high-ranking church associate. That associate was Susana Medina Wajaka. All three had just landed in the United States on the same flight. Ocampo was 36 when she was taken in. California investigators had spent about 18 months building their case against the group. They used witness statements, phone records, and deep behavioral analysis pulled from victims across several different church locations throughout Southern California. Garcia faced 36 counts in the first indictment. Ocampo's name appeared repeatedly throughout that same massive legal document. These charges proved investigators saw her as more than a side player. She was a structural pillar of the entire operation. She had a specific job in a dark, recurring cycle of abuse that had claimed many victims over several years. In October 2020, Ocampo pleaded guilty to 3 counts of illegal contact with a minor for sexual purposes and 1 count of forcible sexual penetration. Her cooperation with the prosecution was officially noted by the Office of the California Attorney General. That move became a massive leverage point, forcing Garcia to finally enter his own guilty plea in June 2022. It happened just days before his trial started, right as they were about to begin picking the jury. On October 12, 2022, a judge sentenced Ocampo to 4 years in a California state prison. With credit for the 3 years and 4 months she had already served since her arrest, her release from custody was already being calculated. After the sentencing, Judge Cohen noted that in his 38 years on the bench, he had seen many dark things, but he was still struck by how religious faith could be twisted into a weapon to harm those who had placed their deepest trust in it. The disturbing pattern the judge saw wasn't just limited to Ocampo's case. It showed up in the exact same way, in the actions of the woman who was standing beside her when they were arrested together 3 years ago. That woman had already been sentenced 4 months before this hearing even took place. This is her story now. Case 6, Susana Medina Wajaka. The arrest report from the airport on June 3, 2019, listed 3 key names. First was Nason Garcia, the leader of the church and the main target of the state's investigation. He had been under the state's microscope since 2018. The second name on that list was Alondra Ocampo. And the third was Susana Medina Wajaka, who was only 27 years old when the handcuffs went on. Documents identified her as a high-ranking female leader within the church's operations across Southern California. All 3 arrived on the same flight from abroad. Police took them into custody the moment they stepped off the plane. What started as a standard travel record became the foundation for a third, massive criminal case running alongside the others. Her case had its own evidence and path, separate from the other 2 defendants. It was tied to them by the same church roots and predatory methods. It followed the same dark pattern of behavior inside the same organization during those same years. Records show Wajaka was younger than her co-defendant. She had been groomed into her role within the church hierarchy since she was a young girl. The church culture focused heavily on molding young women into spiritual servants who lived only to follow orders. These women understood that their entire purpose was to show total devotion and service to the powerful leaders above them. For those who made it into Garcia's inner circle, this devotion was essential. This mindset dictated how they behaved and how the girls positioned beneath them in the hierarchy viewed their authority and their actions. Wajaka's entire life had been lived inside the church. Her power came from that background, and prosecutors would prove her crimes were just a continuation of how that authority was always exercised within the church. To her, there was no difference between the church's holy teachings and the illegal tasks she was ordered to carry out. Based on the evidence gathered during the investigation into all 3 suspects, a disturbing truth emerged. Wajaka had weaponized her position of spiritual trust in the exact same way that Ocampo had. Investigators established that she targeted underage girls within the Southern California church network. She groomed them for contact with Garcia, using religious manipulation as the mechanism to ensure that any possibility of refusal was completely gone. Victims were told that testimony developed across the proceedings showed that serving the apostle was a divine act of submission, and refusing him meant positioning yourself entirely outside the will of God. This theological trap was systematic, calculated, and used on many victims over a very long period. The probe into Waka was built alongside the cases against Ocampo and Garcia, with all 3 evolving through separate but coordinated tracks in the same multi-year investigation. The evidence, records of the group's crimes, were bolstered by witness accounts detailing each person's specific role in the operation. Testimony and documentation exposed exactly how they functioned within this dark institutional system. Wajaka's case mirrored Ocampo's, built on victim stories describing a consistent, predatory pattern of approach. Years of conditioning and grooming were applied to many different girls. Investigators realized this wasn't random. It was a functioning, institutionalized structure of abuse. Investigators found that Wajaka and Ocampo together were the gatekeepers, acting as the primary preparation and access mechanism within the Southern California church network. The legal case against Waka took a different turn than Ocampo's. In one major way, her cooperation with the authorities was far more extensive in scope, and it arrived at a strategically decisive moment on June 3, 2022, the very same day Garcia pleaded guilty. Wajaka also pleaded guilty to assault likely to cause great bodily injury. Prosecutors officially credited her cooperation with forcing Garcia's hand, leading him to take a plea deal rather than facing a full public trial. Garcia was eventually sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison and ordered to register as a sex offender for life. In recognition of her extensive and high-quality cooperation, Wajaka received a sentence of 1 year probation, time served, and mandated psychiatric counseling. The outcome? This highlighted the power of cooperation and the institutional failures that allowed this abuse to continue for so many years. Waka's sentencing. In June 2022, a long chapter finally closed. It began with an airport arrest and ended with 3 individuals sentenced in separate proceedings across a 3-year span. Each one was a documented piece of a system that operated inside a religious institution for nearly a decade. Now, let's look at a case together. Different state, different decade. Here, the language of power wasn't religious, it was clinical and psychological. This woman didn't talk about God. She focused on the mind. Case 7, Nancy Salzman. In March 2018, the FBI raided a private home in Waterford, New York. Inside, they found something that wasn't on any standard list of evidence. Inside the home of the co-founder and president of the organization called NXIVM, agents found $520,000 in cash, hidden in bags and boxes. One single container found in the home held more than $390,000 in tightly bundled currency. This discovery wasn't the main goal of the search, but it changed everything. It was the anomaly that expanded the entire investigation's frame, shaping the prosecution of multiple defendants over the next 3.5 years. Nancy Salzman was born in July 1954 and raised in New Jersey. She trained as a nurse and held a license in New York for over 30 years until it expired. By the mid-90s, she had a strong professional reputation in neuro-linguistic programming. This discipline uses behavioral modification and language patterns to change a person's thought. She ran the Brief Therapy Center in Albany, New York, establishing herself as a highly credible practitioner and instructor in her field. Her professional standing was well regarded when she first encountered Keith Raniere in the late 90s, a period her own lawyers called a very difficult time. This was a period her own attorneys later described as the most personally difficult of her life. She took those clinical credentials and used them in what became one of the biggest cult prosecutions in history. Alongside Keith Raniere, Salzman co-founded Executive Success Programs, later called NXIVM, and served as the organization's president. Inside NXIVM, she held the title of prefect, making her second in command only to the leader known as Vanguard. Devotees bowed whenever Salzman walked into a room and stood up the moment she left. Her lessons were rooted firmly in her professional training with NLP. These structured sessions were designed to break down what the group called limiting beliefs through a sequence of courses that grew more intense as students climbed the ranks. Survivors spoke out in court and public reports. Once NXIVM was exposed, they described a world where psychological bonding techniques, building trust and forcing vulnerability were not used to help the students. Instead, they were used to ensure loyalty, financial control, and total submission to Raniere. Ex-board member Alejandro Betanor stated that without Nancy Salzman, NXIVM simply could not have operated. Those she taught remembered her as being both deeply compassionate and chillingly controlling. It was a mix that made it hard to see the danger until they had wasted years inside the organization. Investigators proved that Salzman did far more than just design lessons and teach classes. Between 2005 and 2008, she ran a secret spying operation against anyone who dared to criticize the group or try to leave. They stole private data from their enemies, including journalists who were digging into the organization. They targeted cult experts and former members, hacking into their private email accounts without permission. Evidence also showed that Salzman conspired to obstruct justice during legal battles against the group. She ordered her own training videos to be edited before they were handed over to lawyers, then lied in court by falsely certifying that the footage was the unedited original. Federal agents found more than just the cache. They seized computers and data storage devices. The phones they found helped investigators uncover the full, dark scale of the secret spying operation. The FBI raided her Waterford home in March 2018, 4 months before her official arrest. In July 2018, she was taken into federal custody, alongside her daughter and their bookkeeper, on a major racketeering indictment filed in the Eastern District of New York. In March 2019, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit racketeering, making her the first high-level member to resolve her federal charges. The information she provided following her plea was vital, helping shape the federal prosecutions that unfolded over the next 2.5 years. On September 8, 2021, a federal judge sentenced Salzman to 42 months in prison and ordered her to pay $150,000. The court ruled that the psychological trap she had carefully built, based on her professional training and used to enforce Raniere's absolute power, had caused lasting and measurable damage to the thousands of people who entered the organization. She surrendered to federal authorities in January 2022. The cash found in those shoe boxes during the raid was never fully accounted for in court, yet it remains a permanent and mysterious line item in the federal evidence. The path from a quiet therapy practice in upstate New York to a major racketeering conviction was simply one professional relationship followed for 20 years. This next case shows what that relationship cost once someone else provided the capital to sustain what Salzman built. Case 8. Claire Brumman. The money trail that led Claire Brumman to a Brooklyn courtroom did not start with a whistleblower or a secret police wiretap. It started with a lawsuit. It was just one of many legal battles the group had launched against their critics over the years. When private investigators began reviewing the bank accounts that funded the litigation, a clear pattern finally emerged. There were massive spending levels that simply did not match the actual income reported by the organization. The money moved through complex accounts, designed to hide exactly where the funds were coming from and how they were used. Those financial red flags were just the beginning of a massive criminal case. As the evidence piled up over the next several years, it became clear that the crimes were much bigger than the simple lawsuits that had first exposed them. Claire Bronman was born in 1979, the youngest daughter of billionaire Edgar Bronman Sr. He was the man who turned a family business into one of the biggest liquor empires in the world. Her massive family fortune ranked them among the wealthiest and most powerful private citizens in the United States. She skipped the typical corporate path. Instead, her own public court filings tell a very different and darker story. She found a path for personal development within the structured curriculum of the NXIVM group. She saw it as truly meaningful. She joined the executive board and, by the mid-2000s, had become the cult's primary financial backer. For over 15 years, she poured tens of millions into NXIVM operations, funding their aggressive legal machine and Keith Ranier's very expensive personal lifestyle. Records prove her money-funded failed business deals and bad commodity trades. These trades were in Ranier's name, alongside lawsuits targeting members who dared to leave. Her wealth also powered their push for a global international presence. She was the backbone of NXIVM, the one bankrolling their institutional attacks. As investigators dug deeper, the picture they found was dark. They saw a woman who had fully merged her own identity with the organization and Ranier's personal authority. It was a loyalty she maintained without question for nearly 15 years. Prosecutors proved her financial support was not just passive belief. It wasn't just a simple investment in a curriculum she loved. According to the federal indictment and her guilty plea, it was something far more sinister. Her money was a weapon for organizational control and crushing any outside critic. She financed a brutal litigation campaign against ex-members who publicly criticized the cult. These legal actions were later called meritless by the sentencing court. These cases were designed to drain their bank accounts and force them into silence. She also paid for private investigators to stalk individuals labeled as enemies of the group. She even exploited credit card info. Using a dead member's identity, she moved money for Ranier, hiding his assets from creditors and all federal tax authorities. She also wielded absolute administrative control over the visa papers of a Mexican national known as Jane Doe 12, forcing that woman to work for absolutely no pay whatsoever. When Jane Doe 12 finally asked for a fair wage, Bronfman told her she had to earn her visa through even more free labor. Now, you and I should look at the massive investigation coordinated by the FBI New York office. It involved the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, along with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They tracked the capital flows that funded the group's legal aggression and internal surveillance infrastructure. Agents reconstructed their internal surveillance and Ranier's finances through a massive trail of bank records and wire transfers. They also used testimony from witnesses with direct knowledge of exactly how those funds were being directed and used. The evidence showed a massive fortune used not for charity or even personal gain. Instead, it was a weapon pointed directly and systematically at anyone who challenged the cult's operations or questioned Keith Ranier's absolute authority. Bronfman pleaded guilty in April 2019 to a conspiracy to harbor illegal aliens for her own financial gain. This involved Jane Doe 12 and the fraudulent use of a deceased member's personal financial information. Her plea deal forced her to forfeit $6 million. On September 30th, 2020, the judge sentenced her to 81 months in federal prison. He exceeded the prosecution's request, imposing a $500,000 fine and $96,605 in restitution. During the sentencing, the judge found that she had repeatedly used her immense wealth and social status to intimidate and control others. She targeted anyone in the organization's way, a pattern the court described as deliberate and sustained over many years. She was led away in handcuffs as soon as the hearing ended. The infrastructure she funded didn't just vanish. It had already built the recruitment pipeline and the surveillance tools they used. This leads us to the next case, where the story gets even more direct and very personal. Case 9, Allison Mack. You see, The footage agents reviewed in 2018 was not seized through a warrant or any kind of formal police sting operation. A former NXIVM member recorded the tape during a secret gathering at a home in upstate New York. After quitting the group weeks later, she reached out to the FBI, handing over the recording as proof of what she had seen. The footage captured a ritual that former members described as a regular part of a secret, internal group. We now see how this became a crucial piece of evidence in an investigation that had been quietly building for several months. None of the organizers or leaders had any idea a camera was rolling during the entire event. The woman who turned the tape over to federal agents was one of the many recruited by actress Allison Mack. Allison Mack was born on July 29, 1982 in Pitts. West Germany was her birthplace, where her father, an American opera singer, was working at the time. The family eventually settled in Long Beach, California, where she was raised. By her early 20s, she had already established a highly recognizable career as a television actress. Most famously, she spent a decade starring on the hit show Smallville. Airing from 2001 to 2011, the show gave her a massive public profile and deep connections throughout Hollywood. Colleagues from that era remember her as a highly disciplined and professional young actress. She was deeply invested in her acting and constantly searching for spiritual meaning and personal growth. In 2006, she attended a 2-day introductory program for JS, one of NXIVM's internal women's training sessions. She did not walk away after that first taste. Instead, over the next 10 years, her involvement deepened. Mack became one of the group's most famous faces and one of its most dangerous high-level insiders. She climbed from student to teacher, eventually helping design the group's most abusive and secretive inner structures. By 2015, Mack was a first-line master within DOS's Dominus Obquis Sororium. This secret women's society was something investigators say she helped build right alongside the cult leader, Keith Raniere. DOS was pitched to new members as a supportive sisterhood focused on self-improvement and keeping each other accountable. What they never told the recruits was that Raniere himself was secretly running and controlling the entire group. Women entering DOS were forced to hand over collateral explicit photos and written confessions held as insurance to stop them from ever leaving. Mack personally oversaw the collection of this blackmail material from her own recruits. She hosted initiation ceremonies in her own home, where women were branded with a cauterizing tool before being steered towards sexual encounters with Raniere. The survivors later confirmed the brand actually combined Raniere's and Mack's initials, despite the fact they were told it was a symbol for the 4 elements. Mack had even undergone the branding herself. The DOS structure was a strict pyramid. Every first-line master answered directly to Raniere while managing their own small group of what they called slaves. Mack's recruits included India Oxenberg, daughter of actress Catherine Oxenberg, who would later go public with her horrific experiences inside the cult. Her story helped the public and the courts understand exactly how the group recruited and mind-controlled its many members. By 2018, federal investigators were ready to move on the case. Things sped up quickly after a New York Times investigation was published in October 2017, when several former members went public for the first time about the branding rituals and the reality of life inside DOS. The FBI then scoured digital messages and physical evidence left behind at the ritual sites. Testimony from survivors created a clear, undeniable record of Mack's deep involvement in DOS and the entire NXIVM organization. In April 2018, she was arrested in Brooklyn on federal charges including sex trafficking and forced labor conspiracy. Because she was a famous TV star, her arrest grabbed headlines and stayed in the national spotlight for months. It sparked massive media coverage. This exposure shredded what was left of NXIVM's reputation and exposed their dark secrets to the entire world. By April 2019, UNIC Mack pleading guilty to racketeering charges and agreeing to testify against Keith Raniere. Her cooperation produced a recorded conversation where Raniere discussed the branding rituals in chillingly cold and explicit operational terms. This evidence, shown at trial, helped lead directly to his conviction on multiple counts. On June 30th, 2021, Judge Nicholas Galfus sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, 1,000 hours of community service and a fine of $20,000. She arrived at the federal prison in Dublin, California in September 2021 and was released in July 2023 after 21 months. The recruitment model she built inside DOS used celebrity appeal and the language of female empowerment as a weapon. It was the exact same language Lauren Salzman had been using for years on people she had known her entire adult life within that very same organization. Case 10, Lauren Salzman. The specific testimony that doomed Keith Raniere on federal sex trafficking charges in June 2019 did not come from an outside investigator or a confidential informant developed through law enforcement channels. It came from a woman who had been a member of NXIVM for nearly 20 years. She held one of its highest functional titles in the hierarchy and was introduced to Raniere by her own mother. For 4 days on the witness stand in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, Lauren Salzman broke down the internal mechanics of the organization with enough detail that prosecutors called her words the most complete insider testimony ever provided by any cooperating witness in the case. It was the final statement of a woman who had been there at the start of everything. She was now tearing down before a federal jury, after helping build and run that dark structure for 20 years before it was exposed. Lauren Salzman was born around 1976 and grew up in Nancy's professional world of neuro-linguistic programming and mental conditioning, therapeutic language, and the behavioral frameworks that would eventually form the core of the twisted NXIVM curriculum. When Nancy Salzman and Keith Raniere co-founded executive success programs in the late 90s, Lauren was studying English literature at the State University of New York at Oswego. Her mother pushed her to finish the initial 6-month training course offered by the group. Within just 2 years, she went from student to senior instructor. She was only 23 when she took that teaching role in the structure her mother and Raniere had built. Over the next 20 years, she climbed to the rank of master inside DOS. She sat directly under Raniere in the subgroup and handled high-level executive duties within NXIVM. This gave her direct knowledge of Raniere's behavior and the group's criminal reach throughout the entire timeline. One of the specific crimes Lauren Salzman confessed to was the long-term imprisonment of a young Mexican woman identified in the court proceedings as Daniela. Based on her testimony and physical evidence shown at the trial, Daniela was an NXIVM member who had made the mistake of liking a man other than Keith Raniere. Raniere personally ordered the punishment. Starting around March 2010, Daniela was locked in a single room at a house in Clifton Park, New York, near the group's main headquarters. The room had one mattress. Security cameras were set up to watch the room's entrance, installed specifically to ensure Daniela had no contact with the outside world. It was a level of cold detail that showed the jury exactly how Raniere's orders were carried out with such cruel, systematic precision. Daniela was told her freedom depended on a process of ethical correction and admission that Raniere defined and controlled completely. She was held for 2 years. The ordeal ended in February 2012. During that time, Daniela wrote daily letters begging for release, which were given to Raniere as evidence. Lauren Salzman admitted under oath that she rarely visited her. When she did visit, she admitted she was not kind. Investigators found evidence of the imprisonment through various witness accounts. They found physical files in Clifton Park and heard from Daniela herself. They also uncovered the full record of Lauren Salzman's conduct as a master, including her recruitment of 6 women as her personal slaves, following Raniere's orders to control and manage those recruits, and her part in a system that the courts ruled was forced labor, extortion, and sex trafficking. She was eventually arrested alongside her mother and 2 others in July 2018, after the whole scheme collapsed. In April 2019, she pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy, then provided 4 days of devastating trial testimony. Prosecutors described her as the most significant witness in the case, the one who secured Ria's conviction and his 120-year sentence. On July 28, 2021, Judge Nicholas Galifas handed Lauren Salzman 5 years of probation and community service, sparing her from spending any more time behind bars. The judge based this ruling on what federal investigators called the extraordinary depth and high quality of her cooperation with the government. Normally, the charges she faced would have meant 87 to 108 months in a federal cell. Victims watching the trial felt this gap was just one final display of the same manipulation they had witnessed while trapped inside the world of NXIVM. The cold, strategic use of closeness and knowledge, and the abuse of relationships to gain an institutional advantage for those who knew how to play the system. Today, Lauren Salzman is serving her term of probation. Her mother has already finished her own federal sentence and was released. The legacy of what both women built and the crimes they committed is now etched into the permanent records of the Eastern District of New York, detailed, public, and unchangeable. 10 women, 10 institutions, and one dark pattern. Authority was accepted, then weaponized. In these cases, trust was never a coincidence, it was the instrument. Looking back across 5 decades and 4 different countries, the record shows that manipulation at this scale requires proximity, and proximity requires trust. In every case we examine here, a woman was close enough to strike only because someone had allowed her to stand in that inner circle. That is the haunting truth no verdict can ever fully resolve, and it is the one that lingers longest.